The bond that bloomed in blood and pine. A werewolf romance, full YouTube script, a long-form YouTube story script, prologue, the hook, 40 seconds. They say a wolf never chooses wrong. They say when a wolf lays himself at your feet, that great scarred body surrendering to nothing but your presence, it means something older than language, something that cannot be faked, cannot be forced, cannot be bought with crowns or conquest. I didn't know that the night I knelt in a ruined cabin, elbow deep in a dying wolf's chest, when the door exploded off its hinges and the most dangerous man in the northern realm walked into my illegal sanctuary. I didn't know it when his amber eyes swept the room, the sleeping wolves, the shelves of forbidden medicine, me, and settled into something I couldn't name. I only knew one thing. The wolf beneath my hands was still breathing, and I was not going to let him go. Whatever came next, chains, execution, the end of everything I had built, could wait 4 minutes. It turned out, the king could wait too. Before we begin, audience CTA, before we step into the story, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you hearing this under the midnight moon or in the quiet of the afternoon? Drop it in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Chapter 1. The door explodes. My name is Maren Voss, and the night my life changed forever, I had blood under my fingernails and pine smoke in my hair. Not the romantic kind of blood. The kind that soaks through aprons and refuses to wash out. The kind that comes from working in places you are not supposed to be, doing things that carry a death sentence in 5 provinces. The cabin was warm. That was the thing I remember most clearly. How warm it was against the November cold pressing through the walls. The fire in the iron stove had burned down to red coals, throwing copper light across the rough-hewn beams, across the shelves I had built myself from salvaged lumber, across the 7 wolves sleeping in various states of recovery, on straw beds and folded blankets. 7 wolves. All of them illegal. All of them mine, in the only way that mattered. They had come to me. I had not gone to them. The one beneath my hands now was the newest arrival. A female, silver gray with a torn ear and a gash across her chest so deep I had spent the last hour just keeping her breathing while I worked. The wound had hit her lung. She was drowning in her own body, and there was nothing elegant or painless about what saving her required. I pressed the resin pack deeper, felt the flutter of ribs, felt the stuttering pulse against my palm. Mothwing fast, weak, but there. Keep going, I told myself. Keep going. Keep going. Keep. The door came off the wall, not opened, not kicked. Exploded inward like it had never meant to stand in the first place. Wood splintered against stone. Cold air rushed through the gap like a wave, carrying the smell of horses and iron and winter rain, and something else underneath. Something wild and electric that made the hair on my arms stand straight. The wolves who were awake scrambled to their feet. The ones who had been sleeping lurched upright with panicked eyes. One of them, a massive brown male I called Dusk, pressed himself against the back wall and bared his teeth in a direction I did not dare look. Because looking would mean stopping, and stopping would mean she died. So I kept my hands exactly where they were. Boots hit the floor behind me. 1 step. 2. Heavy, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who had never in his life needed to announce himself. Every living thing in his path already knew. What is this? The voice was low, quiet in the way that a blade is quiet before it cuts. Conversational, almost gentle, and somehow, impossibly, more frightening than a shout. I knew that voice. Every person in the Northern Territories knew that voice. Alpha King Soren Aldric, ruler of the 5 provinces, warlord of the Thornwall campaign. The man whose name alone had ended 2 sieges without a single sword being drawn. The man who had written the very law I was currently breaking, with both hands, buried in a dying wolf's chest. He was standing 3 feet behind me, in my illegal sanctuary. I was going to die. The thought arrived with perfect clarity, the way simple truths do when panic strips everything else away. It settled into my bones like cold water. I acknowledged it the way you acknowledge bad weather, noted, accepted, moved past. Because the wolf beneath me was still alive, and I was not going to let her go. I said, he began. A wolf with a collapsed lung, I said without turning around. My voice came out steadier than it had any right to. My hands were shaking. My legs had gone numb from kneeling on stone for the better part of an hour. But my voice came out clear and flat and entirely, absurdly calm. If you are going to arrest me, I respectfully ask that you wait 4 minutes. Silence. The kind that pressed against the walls. The kind that had weight. I heard him exhale. One controlled breath. And then, nothing. He stood behind me and watched. I worked. I packed the wound with the moss and resin compound I had spent 3 years developing. I murmured to the wolf in the old language my grandmother had taught me before the fevers took her. The low, rhythmic sounds that meant, I am not a threat. I am not leaving. You are safe. The wolf's breathing steadied. Her heartbeat found a rhythm. It was going to hold. I closed my eyes for half a second, just half, and let out a breath that felt like it had been lodged in my ribcage for the past 40 minutes. Then I pulled my hands free, wiped them on my ruined apron, and stood. And turned around. Alpha King Soren Aldric was enormous. I had known that the way you know mountains are tall or oceans are deep, in the abstract, from a distance, from other people's fear. Knowing it and standing within arm's reach were 2 entirely different experiences. He filled the doorway he had destroyed. Dark armor, travel-worn. A scar running from his left temple to the line of his jaw. Eyes the deep amber of pine resin in firelight, and they were fixed on me with an intensity that made every nerve in my body catch fire. But he wasn't looking at me. Not really. He was looking past me, at the wolf I had just saved, at the 6 others arranged around the cabin, bandaged, sleeping, breathing, at the shelves, at the tinctures, at the careful, meticulous, undeniable evidence of 2 years of illegal healing. His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath the scar. How long? He asked. 2 years. How many wolves? I stopped counting after 200. Something moved across his face. Something I could not read. It might have been fury. It might have been something else entirely. Something that had no name in any language I knew. Before he could speak, a sound came from the corner of the room. Movement. The largest wolf in the cabin, a scarred gray male with a torn ear and a wound across his ribs that I had spent 3 days stitching shut, lifted his massive head from his straw bed and looked at us. First at the king, then at me, and then, with the slow, deliberate calm of a creature that feared absolutely nothing, he stood, crossed the room, and lay down at my feet. He pressed his muzzle against my ankle and closed his eyes. The king went very still, because that wolf, the one now sleeping against my leg like I was the safest place in the world, bore the royal brand on his flank, a mark I recognized from every official seal and wanted poster in the province. He was one of the king's own, and he had chosen me. The king's eyes met mine above the wolf's gray head, and for one frozen, terrifying, impossible second, neither of us moved. Chapter 2. The Woman from Nowhere. 3 hours before the king's door destroyed my life, the morning had started with a snake bite. Fenmore was that kind of village. The kind where mornings started with snake bites and ended with someone's roof caving in from the weight of wet autumn leaves, and everybody just patched it up and kept going. No drama. No fuss. Keep your head down. Do your work. Don't attract attention. I had been very good at that for 5 years. The girl who burst through the apothecary door was Pella, the tanner's youngest, 11 years old, clutching her forearm, wailing at a pitch that rattled the glass jars on the top shelf. "Viper!" she gasped. "In the woodpile." I dropped the calendula I'd been sorting, grabbed my kit, and went to work. Tourniquet first, just above the wrist, tight enough to slow the spread. Then the draw paste, dense green-black, a compound of charcoal, plantain leaf, and crushed elderflower that I had tested and refined across 4 winters of treating farmers, hunters, and one very unlucky blacksmith who had stuck his hand in a hole he should have left alone. I talked while I worked. I always talked. Not because I was nervous, because scared people needed a thread to hold on to, and my voice was the thread I could give them. "You are going to be fine," I told Pella. "The swelling will peak in about an hour, and then start going down. You will feel sick to your stomach. That is the antidote working, not the venom. And you will have a spectacular bruise to show off at the market on Saturday." Pella sniffled. "Will it scar?" "Barely. I will give you something for that, too." By the time her mother arrived in a breathless panic, the girl was sitting upright with her arm neatly wrapped and the color coming back to her face. Her mother pressed 3 copper coins into my hand and was gone before I could argue. I always tried to argue. I always lost. Healing was not a transaction. My grandmother had drilled that into me before I could walk. You do not trade mercy for copper. But the village had a way of paying anyway, slipping coins onto counters and walking out fast, and I had long since learned that the argument itself was a kind of pride I couldn't always afford. I stood alone in the empty shop, holding 3 coins I didn't feel I deserved, and stared at the pale autumn light through the window. That was the shape of my life in Fenmore. I had come here 5 years ago with a satchel, a box of seeds, and a name that meant nothing to anyone. I had rebuilt the apothecary from a shuttered shell into something the village depended on. I had become, in the careful, limited way that served me, trusted. Not known, not really. Nobody in Fenmore knew about the cabin. It sat 2 miles north, deep in the Thornwild, a stretch of dense forest that most people avoided because the paths were unreliable and the wolves were thick. I had found it during my first winter, half collapsed and abandoned, and I had rebuilt it board by board, stone by stone, until it was solid enough to hold what I needed it to hold. The wolves had started coming on their own. That was the part that still startled me, even after 2 years. I had not gone looking for them. I was not a shifter. I carried no pack bloodline, no ancient claim, nothing in any ledger or bloodline chart that should have drawn a territorial wolf within 100 yards of a lone human woman living in the trees. But they came, limping out of the dark with torn flanks and infected wounds and broken bones that had healed wrong. They came to my door and waited, patient and silent, as though they already knew I would open it. The first time, I had been terrified. A massive black wolf with a gash across his shoulder had appeared on my doorstep at dawn, and I had stood frozen in the doorway for a full 60 seconds before my healer's instinct overrode everything else. I treated the wound. I fed him strips of dried venison. I watched him disappear back into the trees by nightfall. He came back 3 days later with another wolf. After that, they never stopped coming. I could not explain it. I was not a mystic or a blessed child of the old gods. I was a woman who knew herbs, who had steady hands, and a stubborn refusal to let anything die if she could prevent it. But the wolves trusted me. They let me touch them, clean their wounds, set their bones. They slept in my cabin and ate from my hands and pressed their warm bodies against my legs while I worked. And it was illegal. Profoundly, catastrophically, court-mandated execution. Illegal. The sovereign edict of the 5 provinces classified unauthorized contact with territorial wolves as a crime against the crown. The penalty ranged from imprisonment to execution, depending on the rank of the wolves involved. The law existed because wolves in the Northern Territories were not just animals. Many were bonded to packs. Some carried shifter bloodlines. A rare few were direct extensions of the Alpha King's own line. Touching one without permission was considered an act of trespass against the king himself. I knew all of this. I knew it the first time I wrapped a bandage around a wolf's torn paw. I did it anyway. That afternoon I closed the apothecary 2 hours early, packed my satchel with fresh supplies, and took the north trail into the Thornwild. I reached the cabin as the light was turning gold through the canopy. 3 wolves were already waiting. 2 I recognized, a mated pair I had been treating for weeks, and 1 new one. Young, lean, deep laceration across his ribs. "Oh, sweetheart," I murmured, kneeling beside him. "What happened to you?" I worked through the evening. The fire crackled. The air was thick with dried lavender and pine resin. I moved between the wolves with quiet efficiency, cleaning and stitching, and applying salve, murmuring in the old tongue without thinking. I did not hear the riders approaching through the Thornwild. I did not see the royal banners through the trees. I did not know that Alpha King Soren Aldric, who had been tracking a missing wolf from his personal guard for 11 days, had just followed its trail directly to my door. The first warning I got was the sound of wood splintering, and the second was his voice, and the third, the thing that changed everything, was the gray wolf with the royal brand pressing himself against my ankle, like I was the only solid thing left in the world. I stood in the ruins of my secret, staring at the king, and thought, I should be terrified. Why am I not terrified? Chapter 3. The Name of the Wolf. His name was Kale. I didn't know that when I first treated him. He had arrived 9 days ago, just before dawn, collapsing at my door with a coat matted dark with old blood, and a fever that had already begun to cook him from the inside. He was the biggest wolf I had ever treated, massive even by territorial standards, his frame built like something out of an old story, the kind of wolf that made you understand in a wordless animal way why people had once worshipped them. The wounds across his ribs were wrong. I had known it the moment I got close enough to examine them. Not animal wounds, not the jagged tiers of teeth or the raking lines of claws. These were precise, parallel, spaced with a deliberateness that made my stomach turn. Someone had cut him with a blade. On purpose. Over and over again. I had spent 3 days just fighting the infection before I could even begin to address the structural damage. He had slipped in and out of consciousness the whole time, lying on the floor of the cabin with his great head pressed against the stone, and I had talked to him, quietly, constantly, in the old tongue, because that was all I had to give him besides the medicine. By day 4, he could lift his head. By day 6, he was eating. By day 9, he was sleeping at the foot of my straw mattress, which he had claimed without asking, and which I had surrendered without argument because it was easier than fighting a wolf the size of a small horse. I had not known he was royal. His brand was on his flank, hidden under the matted fur, and I hadn't found it until the 3rd day, when I was shaving the area around a wound that refused to close. The moment I saw it, that small, precise mark burned into his skin, my blood had gone cold. I had kept going anyway. He was already healing. I wasn't going to stop. Now he lay pressed against my ankle in the firelit cabin, while the king, his king, stood 6 feet away with an expression I had never seen on a man's face before. It took me a moment to name it. Relief. Raw, staggered, desperate relief. The kind that only comes after a very long time of fearing the worst. Kyle, the king said. The name came out rough, scraped. The gray wolf lifted his head at the sound, looked at the king, yawned, settled his chin back onto my foot, and closed his eyes. I watched something move across the king's face. He crouched slowly, a man that size moving with a care that seemed almost painful, and extended one hand, palm up, open. Kale opened one eye, regarded the offered hand, closed his eye, pressed himself more firmly against my leg. Something broke across the king's face. There and gone in less than a second. But I saw it. A flash of hurt so raw and unguarded that my breath caught. He will not come to me, the king said. Flat. Controlled. The voice of a man who had spent a lifetime turning feelings into statements. I knelt beside Kale and placed my hand on his flank. He was warm. His breathing was steady. He is still healing, I said. Wolves who have been hurt by people take time to trust again, even people they loved before. The king looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since entering the cabin. Not at the wolves, not at the shelves of illegal medicine, at me. Like he was trying to understand what category of creature I belonged to. You speak about wolves as though you understand them. I do not understand them, I said. But I listen. A sound came from the shattered doorway. A man in military uniform, broad-shouldered, with the clipped posture of someone who had spent years making his body into a weapon. The king's commander, I would later learn his name was Corvain, appeared in the frame. Sire. His tone was flat and professional, and carved from old stone. The woman is in violation of the sovereign edict. She should be detained and brought before the provincial magistrate. The king did not turn around. What is your name? He asked me. Maren Voss. I run the apothecary in Fenmore. I treat people too, not just wolves. Sire, Corvain pressed. I am aware of what the edict says, the king said. I wrote it. My blood went cold. He stood, every movement carrying the economy of a man who had never in his life wasted effort. She healed one of my wolves, he said. One that my own trackers could not find for 11 days. One that someone in my own ranks may have tried to kill. He paused. And you want me to arrest her? Corvain's mouth opened, closed. She comes with us to Ashenmere, the king said. The name landed like a stone dropped in still water. Ashenmere, the royal seat, the king's stronghold, the center of power for the entire northern realm, a fortress carved into the side of a mountain, which I had seen exactly once, from a distance of 3 miles, on a winter road, and which had looked exactly as welcoming as a drawn sword. Why? I asked. The king looked down at Kyle, who had still not moved. Because that wolf trusts you more than he trusts me, he said. And I need to know why. He walked out without waiting for a response. I stood alone in the ruins of my carefully constructed life and looked down at the wolf sleeping against my ankle. Kale's ear twitched. His breathing was slow and even. Outside through the broken door, I could see soldiers on horseback. At least 12, armed, patient. One of them was already bringing a horse for me, a quiet chestnut mare with kind eyes, as though someone had chosen her deliberately. I thought about the cabin, the wolves still healing inside it, the 2 years of work I was about to leave unguarded in the Thornwild. I climbed onto the horse with shaking hands. About an hour into the ride, Corvain fell beside me. His voice was pitched low, barely above the sound of hoofbeats. You should know, he said, that the king has not slept in 4 months. I stared at him. What? 4 months since the Ashenfall. He closes his eyes and wakes within minutes. Every time. Corvain's jaw tightened. He is dying, Miss Voss. Slowly, but he is dying. Why are you telling me this? The commander looked ahead at the king's rigid back and said nothing for a moment. Then, that wolf has not let anyone touch him since the Ashenfall. Not the king, not his handlers. He attacked 3 men who tried, but he let you. He fell silent. I stared at the back of the king's head and felt something cold settle in my stomach. I was not being brought to Ashenmere as a prisoner. I was being brought as an experiment, and I had no idea what would happen if I failed. Chapter 4. The Fortress and the Ghost. Ashenmere was carved into the side of a mountain. I had told myself during the long, cold ride that I was prepared for it. I had seen it from a distance. I had heard the stories. Every person in the 5 provinces grew up with the stories. The stronghold that had never fallen. The gates that had never opened to an enemy. The Alpha King's seat, ancient and unmovable as the rock it was built from. Seeing it at distance and riding through its shadow were 2 entirely different experiences. The walls rose black against the dying sun, so high that looking up at them made something in your chest go small and tight. The towers climbed toward clouds that were already pulling a pale gray dusk over the peaks. The main gates were iron, not painted iron, not coated iron. Iron that had been here so long, it had become something almost geological, part of the mountain itself. When they opened, the sound echoed through my ribcage like a second heartbeat. Inside, the keep was overwhelming in the way of very old things that have never had to try to be impressive. Torchlight. Stone floors worn smooth by centuries of boots. Corridors branching in every direction. Servants moving with the quiet efficiency of people who had been doing this long enough that they no longer thought about it. And cold. Not the outdoor cold of the mountain, a different kind. The cold of a place where something warm had gone out. I felt it the moment I stepped inside, the way you feel a house where someone has recently grieved. A woman met us in the main hall, thin, sharp-featured, silver threading through dark hair pinned back with the severity of someone who had long ago decided appearances were for other people. She was the king's head healer. Her name was Thessaly Morn, and the look she gave me when she turned from Corvain could have curdled milk. "This is the apothecary?" she asked. "Miss Voss," Corvain confirmed. Thessaly circled me, slowly. The way you circle a questionable purchase at a market stall. You have no formal training. I apprenticed under my grandmother. She was a root healer in the eastern valleys. A root healer. The words dropped from her mouth with exactly as much respect as I had expected, which was none. She outlined my restrictions with brisk efficiency. East Wing. No leaving without escort. No touching the king's wolves without direct supervision. I understood, I said, even though every condition felt like a cage closing. Corvain walked me to my room in silence. It was small, clean. A narrow bed, a writing desk, a window overlooking the valley below where the last amber light was dissolving into gray. "The king will send for you tomorrow," Corvain said from the doorway. "Commander." I stopped him before he could leave. "Kyle, where will they put him?" "The royal wolf quarters, with the others. He will not settle there." "Not yet." Corvain studied me. He has been through a long journey. New environment. Strange wolves he hasn't seen in months. His wounds are still healing. If he panics in an unfamiliar space... "You want him with you?" Corvain said. "I want him somewhere he feels safe." The commander was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and left. 20 minutes later, 2 guards carried Kyle in on a stretcher. He had been sedated for the last leg of the journey, and set him beside my bed. I knelt and checked his stitches. Holding. The fever had not returned. I adjusted the blanket over him, smoothed the fur along his neck, and then sat on the cold stone floor, with my back against the bed, and my knees drawn up. "We are in the king's house," I told him quietly. "I do not know exactly what they want from us. But I am not going anywhere." Kale's ear twitched in his sleep. I closed my eyes. I woke in the dark to the sound of claws on stone. The fire had burned to embers. The room was charcoal gray, the only light coming from the faint orange glow of the coals and the pale thread of moonlight through the window. Kale was on his feet. He stood rigid in the center of the room, ears flat, hackles raised, a low vibration of growl moving through his chest. His eyes were fixed on the door. My pulse spiked. I stood slowly, placing myself between him and whatever was on the other side. "Easy," I whispered. "Easy." The door opened. No knock. No announcement. Alpha King Soren Aldric stood in the corridor, alone. No guards, no ceremony. Just a loose linen shirt, dark trousers, and the expression of a man who had not slept in 4 months. Up close, in the low light, stripped of the armor and the tension of the ruined cabin, he looked exhausted in a way that went past tired and into something structural. Like sleep deprivation had started rearranging his features from the inside. His eyes were red-rimmed. The bones of his face stood out in sharper relief than they should have. He looked at the growling wolf. He looked at me. "He used to sleep at the foot of my bed," the king said quietly. "Every night." The grief in his voice was so plain that it felt like witnessing something private. Something I wasn't meant to see. "What happened to him?" I asked. "The truth. Not what your trackers reported." He leaned against the doorframe. The motion was almost imperceptible, the kind of lean that a man running on nothing allows himself when he thinks no one is watching. I noticed. I noticed the shifted weight, the hand bracing against the wood, the slight tremor in his fingers. "There was a fire," he said, "during the Ashenfall campaign. An ambush. My wolves were with me." He stopped. The silence stretched. 12 went into that valley. 4 came back. Kale was not one of them. But he survived. He survived. When we finally found him, weeks later, he attacked anyone who came near. Not me. Not his handlers. No one. And then he disappeared. I looked down at Kyle. He was still growling, low and constant, but his eyes had shifted. They moved between me and the king, with something complicated in them. Recognition and fear wound together like rope. "He remembers you," I said. "He fears me," the king corrected. "Those are not the same thing." He looked at me, and for a moment the mask slipped completely. Exhaustion and grief and guilt, all of it bare in amber eyes that had no defenses left. "Can you help him?" he asked. The way he asked it, quiet, raw, stripped of every scrap of authority, told me he was not only asking about the wolf. "Yes," I said. "But it will take time and trust. He needs to choose you again." "On his own terms," the king nodded, straightened with visible effort, turned to leave. "Your Majesty?" He paused. "When was the last time you slept?" His shoulders tightened. He didn't answer. The door closed behind him, and I stood in the dark, listening to his footsteps fade. Beside me, Kale whimpered once, very softly, and pressed against my leg. I wrapped my arms around him. He was trembling. "I know," I whispered. "I know." I held him long after the trembling stopped, and somewhere in the back of my mind a thought I didn't want to name was already forming. Sharp and unavoidable. The wolf was not the only one in this fortress who needed saving. Chapter 5. The Isolation Wing. Within 3 days of my arrival, Corvain took me to see the surviving wolves of the Ashenfall. The royal wolf quarters were attached to the eastern wall of the keep, a sprawling stone complex that managed to be both impressive and deeply wrong. Heated stone floors, ventilated chambers, a full staff of handlers and veterinary healers who had trained for years under the Crown's best practitioners. And every single one of them was losing. The wolves that had come back from the valley were broken. Not physically, those wounds had healed months ago, but something deeper had been damaged. The kind of damage that does not show up on skin. They paced their enclosures without stopping. They refused food for days at a time. They snarled at their handlers. They cowered from loud noises. They woke in the night, howling at nothing. 3 had become so dangerous they had been moved to a separate wing. Muzzled, chained. I stood at the entrance to the isolation wing and felt my stomach turn. "Unchain them," I said. The chief handler, a stocky man named Devoren, with forearms like tree roots and the expression of someone who had heard every possible bad idea, and this was a new one, looked at me like I had suggested setting fire to the keep. "Those wolves will take your arm off." "They are terrified," I said. "Chaining a terrified animal makes it more dangerous, not less." "You are teaching them that captivity equals pain." Devoren opened his mouth. Corvain cleared his throat. "The king has authorized Miss Voss full access to the wolf quarters. She has his permission to try whatever she sees fit." Devoren looked at me with an expression that said, "On your head, be it." I entered the first isolation chamber alone. The wolf inside was enormous, a dark brown male with a muzzle scarred from the chains, and eyes burning with a directionless fury that I recognized. That fury wasn't aggression. It was a cornered thing, a creature who had learned that the world hurt, and that the only response left was to hurt back first. He lunged the moment the gate opened, hit the end of his chain with a force that rattled the iron ring in the wall and shook dust from the ceiling. The sound, chain, ring, stone, echoed through the corridor. I sat down on the cold floor, 6 feet away, and opened my satchel. The compound I took out was something I'd been developing since my first year in the Thornwild. Pine resin, lavender oil, chamomile, and something else I had never been able to name. Something my grandmother had called the quiet. A smell that meant, I am not a threat. I am not a cage. I am not pain. I opened the jar and set it between us. Then I waited. 20 minutes. The snarling faded to a low growl. 45. He lay down, body still coiled, still ready, but no longer lunging. An hour. His nose twitched. The rigid tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction. 90 minutes. His eyes closed. I walked out. Devoren was waiting with an expression I couldn't quite read. How? He asked. Patience, I said, and the right smell. I have been handling wolves for 20 years. That animal nearly killed Travitt when he tried to change the water bowl. Travitt approached him, standing up, wearing leather armor, carrying a chain. Everything about that interaction told the wolf he was a threat. I sat on the floor and offered him something that smelled like a forest. That is not skill. That is common sense. Devoren stared at me for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly, went inside, and quietly unchained the wolf. I worked through the isolation wing one wolf at a time over the following days. Some took hours. One, a young female with burn scars across her back that made my throat tight to look at, took 2 full days before she would allow me within arm's reach. But they all came, eventually. And as they healed, the keep shifted around me. The handlers stopped watching with suspicion and started watching with curiosity. Devoren brought me supplies without being asked. Thessaly's hostility softened into clipped, professional questions. What concentration of lavender oil? Where did you source the pine resin? Our suppliers carry a different grade. I answered everything. I held nothing back. If these people could learn the methods, carry them forward after I was gone, then every wolf in the realm would benefit. That mattered more than credit, more than recognition. Through all of it, the king watched. I caught him at it. A shadow in a doorway. A figure on the balcony overlooking the wolf yard. A presence I felt before I saw, like a change in air pressure. He never entered while I worked. Never interrupted. He simply observed. And each time I caught his gaze, I saw a man watching someone do the thing he could not. One evening I returned to my room to find a new pillow on my bed. Thick, soft, clean linen. No note. The next morning, a wool cloak draped over my chair. Dark green, fur-lined, finer than anything I'd ever owned. No note. Thank you for the pillow, I told him when I passed him in the corridor 2 days later. And the cloak. He frowned. I don't know what you are referring to. Of course not. My mistake. His ears went red. He walked away faster than usual. That night, lying awake with Kale warm against my feet, I thought about the man behind the stone mask. The man who left gifts he would not claim. Who watched his wolves heal from a distance because he believed they no longer wanted him near. Who had not slept in 4 months and carried that loss in every rigid line of his body. The warmth behind my ribs had been growing since the first night. I had been pretending it was sympathy, the kind of feeling you had for any creature in pain. Lying there in the dark, I stopped pretending. This is going to be a problem, I whispered to Kale. He huffed in what felt remarkably like agreement. Chapter 6. The wolf chose first. I had been reading aloud to the wolves. It had started as an experiment. I had noticed in the Thornwild cabin that the sound of my voice seemed to calm them. Not the words themselves, but the rhythm. The low, constant thread of human sound in a space that otherwise held only animal breath and the crackle of fire. In the royal wolf quarters, with 7 recovering wolves and a great deal of tension compressed into a stone room, I had reached for the first book that came to hand, a field guide to northern wildflowers, dense with botanical descriptions and soil composition charts, and simply begun reading. It worked better than I expected. I had been at it for perhaps 40 minutes. The 3 most responsive wolves settled around me in various states of relaxed wakefulness when the door opened. The king walked in. He stopped just inside the threshold. No crown, no weapons, just dark clothes, slightly rumpled, and the careful blankness of a man trying very hard to look like he was not nervous. "Corvain suggested I observe," he said. "Of course. Please sit wherever you are comfortable." He chose the stone bench furthest from the wolves, sat with his forearms on his knees, head slightly bowed, making himself smaller, unthreatening. I recognized the instinct. It was the same thing I did when I first entered a new wolf's space. I resumed reading. 10 minutes passed. The young female with burned scars stopped trembling. 20 minutes. The wolf in the corner lay down. 30 minutes. The male I had named Havoc, because that was what he had been in the first days before the compound and the patients had reached him, crossed the room. Not toward me, toward the king. I stopped reading. My breath held itself. Havoc stopped 3 feet from Soren and stood very still, amber eyes fixed on the man sitting with his head bowed. The king did not move, did not reach out, did not speak. Just sat there, breathing slowly, as though he understood that stillness was the only language available right now. The wolf took 1 step, then another. He pressed his nose against the king's knee. The king's hand shook. I watched him lift it, trembling, genuinely trembling, from a man whose hands I had seen hold absolute stillness under circumstances that would unravel most people, and place it, with extraordinary gentleness, on the wolf's head. Havoc closed his eyes. A sound came from the king's throat. Low, involuntary. The sound of something cracking open after being locked too long. I looked away. The moment was too private. I stared at the page in my lap and blinked hard against the burning in my eyes, and told myself very firmly that this was not the time. When I looked up, his eyes were closed. His breathing had changed, deepened, slowed. The deliberate rhythm of a man fighting sleep and losing. His head dipped forward, caught, dipped again. His chin dropped to his chest. His hand went slack against Havoc's head. He was asleep. I counted the minutes. 5, 10, 15, 23. Corvain appeared silently in the doorway. He took 1 look at the scene, the sleeping king, the wolf pressed against his knee, the other wolves arranged around the room like sentinels, and went completely still. Then he looked at me and mouthed 2 words. "Do not move." I did not move. 28 minutes. 31. The king stirred. His eyes opened, unfocused, and for a moment, just a moment, before the mask came back, he looked so young and so lost that something in my chest ached like a bruise being pressed. His hand was still on the wolf's head. When he registered that, something raw moved across his expression. Then he saw where he was. Saw me. Saw Corvain in the doorway. The mask came back. Fast. Definitive. Like a door slamming. He stood. Left the room without a word. His stride long and deliberate, as though he could outpace the fact of having been seen. Corvain waited until the footsteps faded. 31 minutes, he said quietly. Was it the wolf? I thought about Havoc crossing the room, the wolf choosing. The king's entire body unclenching the moment he felt warm weight against his knee. I think it was being trusted, I said. He came back the next day. And the next. Each time the wolves moved a little closer. Each time he slept a little longer. 40 minutes, 52, an hour and 17 minutes. That last one he woke from with a startled jerk and left so fast he nearly knocked Corvain over in the doorway. The gifts continued. A leather-bound journal, a jar of wildflower honey from the southern provinces, boots, perfectly sized, soft brown leather lined with wool, that appeared one morning outside my door, as though they had grown there overnight. "I notice you have new boots," Thessaly remarked during one of our increasingly cordial exchanges over herb inventories. "They appeared," I said. Thessaly gave me a long, dry look. "The king," she said, "is about as subtle as a landslide." One evening, adjusting Kyle's bandages, I heard a knock at my door. Soft, hesitant. The king stood in the corridor. He looked uncertain, almost nervous. It sat strangely on a face built for authority. "I owe you an explanation," he said. He sat in my chair, too large for it by half, his knees nearly touching the bed frame, and I sat on the bed, and the room felt very small with him in it. Very warm. "The wolves are not the only ones the Ashenfall damaged," he said. He stared at the floor between his boots. "The things I saw in that valley. The decisions I made." He paused. "They follow me into sleep." I let him talk. He told me about the ambush. The fire set deliberately to trap his wolves in the valley. The decision to press forward because retreating meant surrendering the eastern province entirely. The men and wolves he had lost. The sounds they had made. The smell. I listened without interrupting. I held every word. When he finished, the fire had burned to embers. "Thank you for listening," he said at the door. Then, without turning, "The boots are from the cobbler in the lower town. If they do not fit, tell Corvain, and he will have them adjusted." I smiled. "I thought you did not know what I was referring to." His ears went red. He left quickly. Alone, I pressed my hands against the ache behind my ribs. Cale climbed onto the bed, which he was absolutely not supposed to do, and laid his enormous head in my lap. "I am in so much trouble," I whispered. The wolf sighed in a way that suggested he agreed completely. Chapter 7. The Saboteur. The night everything shifted, I was not even in the wolf quarters. I was in the dispensary, cataloging the herb stores Thessaly had finally agreed to share with me. A significant concession from a woman who had initially treated my arrival with the warmth usually reserved for weather damage when Devoren found me. He stood in the doorway. Something in his face was wrong. Not alarmed exactly. Careful. "Miss Voss, you should come to the isolation wing." The wolf I found there was one I hadn't treated yet. A young male, maybe 2 years old, smaller than the others, one of the last survivors of the Ashenfall, kept separate because his aggression had been the most acute in the early weeks. He had only recently been calm enough to consider approaching. He was lying on his side. His stitches, the ones across his shoulder that a member of Thessaly's team had applied 3 days ago, had come apart. Not torn, unpicked. The thread had been cut, I realized as I crouched over him. Deliberately and recently. I worked fast, the anger building cold and quiet in my chest, while my hands stayed steady, because they had to. "Who was in here?" I asked without looking up. Devoren's voice was tight. "Travet." He said he was doing a routine check. Travet? The handler who had been hostile since my first day. The one who had told Corvain, in a voice carefully pitched to Carrie, that the king was wasting time on a hedge witch from a border village. When I finished, the wolf was stable. I stood and looked at Devoren. "This is not the first time, is it?" I asked. The chief handler met my eyes. "No," he said, "but it is the first time I can prove it." We went to Corvain. He listened with the still, absorptive attention of a man trained to extract information from chaos. When we finished, he was quiet for a moment. "This is not just sabotage of the wolves," Corvain said. "This is a message. Someone inside this fortress does not want the healing to succeed." "Cale," I said. "His wounds. Someone cut him deliberately before he disappeared. Precise, surgical cuts. This is the same person. Or the same faction, Corvain said. We looked at each other. Does the king know? I asked. He is about to. The meeting happened that evening. I was not there for most of it. I waited in the corridor with de Vorin while the sounds of a controlled, very quiet, very cold conversation filtered through the door of the king's council chamber. When the king emerged, his face was composed and unreadable, which I was beginning to understand meant the opposite of calm. He looked at me. Travitt has been removed from the compound, he said. There will be an investigation. You and the wolves will have additional guard presence beginning tonight. He turned to go. Your Majesty. He stopped. Kale, I said. I think whoever did this to Travitt's wolf wanted to see if I would miss it, if I would report it. They are testing whether I can be used against you. The amber eyes were very still. Can you be? He asked. The question was direct, flat, not accusing, genuinely asking. I met his gaze. No. He nodded once, walked away. I stood in the corridor and the cold certainty settled through me like stone. Someone inside Ashenmere had hurt Kale. Deliberately, methodically. Someone who understood wolf physiology well enough to cause suffering without killing. Someone who wanted the king's bonded wolves broken. Why? Because a king without his wolves was a different kind of king. And that night, lying awake with Kale warm and heavy against my side, another thought surfaced. Kale had come to me in the Thornwild. He had been driven there by pain and fear. Yes. But the Thornwild was 2 days' travel from Ashenmere. He had passed through 3 provinces, dozens of settlements with healers who might have helped. He had come specifically to my door, as though he had known, as though something in him had recognized something in me, long before I had any reason to understand what that recognition meant. Chapter 8. What the Nightmare Showed. 3 weeks into my stay at Ashenmere, on a morning so quiet it felt like the world was holding its breath, it happened. The king was on his bench, asleep for nearly 2 hours, his longest stretch yet. The wolves were settled around the room like warm islands in the stone sea. Corvain had allowed himself to lean against the far wall with his eyes closed. Even the torches seemed to burn lower, as though the whole keep had decided to be gentle with this hour. Kale lay across my lap, heavier than he had any right to be, his breathing slow and even beneath my hand. I had been reading. I had stopped reading. I sat in the gold quiet and let myself, just for a moment, feel it, this fragile, impossible, temporary peace. And then Soren screamed. Not a shout, not a gasp, a scream. Raw and torn from somewhere below language, the kind of sound that should not have come from a human throat. His body jackknifed off the bench. His eyes were open and seeing nothing. Pupils blown wide and fixed on something that existed only behind them. His hands grasped at air. The wolves erupted. Kyle launched to his feet, snarling. The 2 sleeping wolves scrambled backward, crashing into equipment. The young female backed into the corner and pressed flat against the wall, whining. Corvain was through the door in an instant with his blade drawn. I crossed the room. 3 strides, maybe 4. I took the king's face between my hands. His skin was ice cold. His body shook so violently I could feel it in my teeth. Soren, I said. His name, not his title. I had never used it before. It felt like something I was not supposed to have. A key to a door I hadn't been given permission to touch. Soren. Come back. His eyes found mine, but could not see me. Behind them, I glimpsed something reflected, the shape of fire. Something vast and terrible and alive. Come back to me, I whispered. I pressed my forehead against his. His hand shot up and gripped my wrist. The pressure was crushing. The grip of a man who could break bone without effort, who was not aware of where he was or what he was holding. I gasped. I did not pull away. Soren, you are here. You are safe. The shaking slowed. His grip loosened. Awareness came back into his eyes, like water filling a vessel. Slow, then rushing. He blinked. He saw me. "Maren," he said. My name in his mouth sounded like the first breath after drowning. He looked down at my wrist, at the marks his fingers had left, red, distinct, already beginning to deepen. Horror washed across his face. "You did not hurt me," I said before he could speak. "I could have, but you did not." He pulled away, stood so abruptly the bench scraped against stone, looked at Corvain, at the drawn blade, at the agitated wolves pacing the edges of the room. His jaw was locked. "Clear the room," he said. "Now." I left. I did not argue. The shame in his eyes, the self-loathing, the absolute conviction that he was dangerous, pushing him now would only drive him further behind his walls. I understood that instinct too well. It was the same one that had made me build a secret cabin 2 miles into a forbidden forest, rather than ask for help. Back in my room, I pressed my fingers against the marks on my wrist. They would be gone by morning. The image of his expression when he saw them would stay much longer. 2 days passed. The king locked himself in his chambers. He did not come to the wolf quarters. He did not emerge for meals. Corvain brought reports of him sitting alone in the dark, refusing to open the door to anyone. "He is punishing himself," I told Corvain. "He believes he is protecting everyone else." Those are the same thing. I threw myself into work. My hands shook. My concentration fractured at edges. I dropped a jar of salve and stood staring at the broken glass on the floor for a long moment before I could make myself move. Thessaly found me like that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down before you fall down." I sat. She studied me with the sharp, clinical eye of a woman who had spent 30 years reading bodies. "How long?" she asked. "This ache, the inability to function when he is not nearby. I do not know what you are talking about. Child, I have served 3 kings and watched 2 mating bonds form before my eyes." Thessaly leaned forward. "I know exactly what I am looking at. And so do you." "I am not a shifter," I whispered. "I cannot bond with him. It is not possible." Thessaly took my hand. The gesture was so unexpected I nearly flinched. "Why do you think the wolves come to you?" she asked. "Have you never truly wondered?" "Because I help them. Wolves do not seek help from humans. Not wild wolves. Not territorial wolves. In 30 years, I have never seen a wolf voluntarily approach an unaffiliated human for healing, unless that human carries something the wolf recognizes." "Recognizes as what?" "Pack." The word settled into the room like a stone into still water. "Your grandmother," Thessaly continued. "The root healer. What was her bloodline? She never said. She raised me after my parents died. She taught me everything: herbs, healing, patience. But she never talked about where she came from. She said the past was past. I think she came from wolves," Thessaly said. "And I think whatever gift she carried, she passed it to you. The idea should have been impossible. And yet it fit like a key into a lock I had not known existed. The wolves. The warmth I felt when I healed them. The connection that went deeper than medicine. It does not matter what I am," I said finally, "if he will not open his door." Thessaly squeezed my hand. "Then knock louder," she said. Chapter 9. The door opens. That evening I stood outside the king's chambers. The corridor was empty. The torches threw long, unsteady shadows across stone that had been here for centuries. Stone that had absorbed more grief and anger and impossible decisions than I could imagine. I could feel him through the door. That was the only way I could describe it. The pull beneath my sternum, constant and insistent, like a hook attached to something that lived in me. When he was near, it was warm. When he was far, it ached. Right now, it was almost unbearable. I knocked. Silence. I knocked again. "Go away." His voice was muffled and wrecked. "No." A pause. Maren, locking yourself in your room is not a strategy, I said through the door. It is a very large tantrum. I heard movement, the lock turning. The door opened. He looked terrible, gray-skinned, hollow-eyed, the bones of his face standing out in sharp relief. 2 days of nothing layered over 4 months of almost nothing. He was still in the same clothes he had been wearing when he locked himself away. His hair was disordered. His eyes were red. And somehow, standing in that doorway, he was still the most present person I had ever been in a room with. "You need to leave," he said. "I need to stay. And so do you." In the same room, preferably within arm's reach. His jaw clenched. "I grabbed you hard enough to leave marks. I have had worse from a spooked horse. You were in a nightmare. You did not know where you were. That is the problem." His voice dropped. "If I cannot tell the difference between the nightmare and reality..." He stopped. "I would sooner lose my crown than hurt you." The words hit me like a closed fist. Not because they were dramatic, because I knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had spent years learning to listen beneath what people said, that he meant every syllable. Without reservation. Without performance. "Then let me help you," I said, "so it does not come to that. You cannot fix this. Maybe not. But I can be there when it drags you under, and I can pull you back. Those are different things." His fingers pressed into the doorframe until his knuckles went white. "One condition," he said finally. "You sleep on the far side of the room." I stepped inside. The ache behind my ribs eased for the first time in 2 days. He had placed a chair near the window, as far from his bed as the room allowed. I settled into it. He lay down on the bed with the rigid tension of a man who trusted nothing, not even his own body. I watched him fight sleep for hours. He lay with his jaw locked and his fists clenched against the sheets, and I could see, in the line of his shoulders, in the controlled stillness of his breathing, how much effort it took just to keep himself from getting up, from finding something useful to do, from running from the vulnerability of closing his eyes in another person's presence. Exhaustion won. It always wins eventually. His entire frame surrendered at once, not gradually, but in the way of structures that have been holding too long. All at once, everything let go. His shoulders dropped, his hands uncurled, his face went slack. He slept. I counted 40 minutes before it started, the low sound that built from nothing, the full body tremors that made the bed frame shudder, the fingers clawing at the sheets. I crossed the room, sat on the edge of the bed, took his hand. The trembling stopped. Instantly, like a candle pinched out. His fingers closed around mine, desperate, unconscious. The grip of someone drowning who has found something solid. And within seconds his breathing evened out. The nightmare released him. He sank deeper into sleep, and I sat beside him in the dark and felt the warmth beneath my ribs settle into something I finally stopped fighting. I stayed until dawn. When the first gray light came through the window, I carefully extracted my hand and moved back to my chair. His eyes opened the moment I let go. "How long?" he asked. His voice was rough, stripped. 5 hours? He stared at me. 5 unbroken hours. The first since the ashen fall. I knew it even before he said it, because I had been sitting in the dark counting every one of them like something precious. "You were supposed to stay in the chair. You were having a nightmare." I came closer. There is a difference between the man who grabbed my wrist and the man who needed someone to hold his hand. He sat up slowly. The movement brought him close enough that I could see the dawn light catching the scar along his jaw. Close enough that I could smell pine and iron and something warm underneath. Something that pulled at something in me at a level below thought. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. I thought about lying, about citing duty or compassion or a healer's oath. All true, none of them the truth. "Because I feel you," I said. "All the time." like a thread beneath my ribs. When you are close, it is warm. When you are far, it hurts. When you are in pain. I stopped. He was very still. I know it should not be possible, I continued, but Thessaly thinks my grandmother carried wolf blood, and whatever she was, she passed it to me. The wolves recognized something in me. I looked at him, and so do you. I know you do. Yes, he said. One word, barely audible. Then stop sending me away. You should be afraid of me. I am not, and neither are your wolves. Not anymore. I leaned forward. Kyle let you touch him yesterday. While you were sleeping, I set your hand on his flank, and he pressed into your palm. He chose you, Soren. He is choosing you back. Something shattered behind his eyes. The last wall crumbled, and what was behind it was not the controlled king or the stone-faced warlord. It was a man so tired and so lonely and so terrified of breaking the things he loved that he had locked himself away from all of them. I cannot stop it, he said. His voice broke on the last word. The fire, the valley. Every time I close my eyes, I am there. I can smell the smoke. I can hear them dying. My wolves. My men. And I gave the order. I pressed forward, and they followed me, and they burned. I sat beside him and took his hand. You gave the order to save an entire province, I said, and it cost you everything. That is not a crime. That is the weight of leadership. It feels like murder. I know. But you are carrying the weight of every life you could not save, and you are using it to punish yourself. The nightmares are not just memory. They are a sentence you keep passing on yourself every night. He was shaking. I could feel it through our joined hands. You are allowed to put this down, I said. You are allowed to grieve and still choose to live. The men and wolves who followed you did not follow you, so you could die slowly in a locked room. They followed you because you were worth following. Honor them by surviving. He leaned forward. His forehead came to rest against my shoulder, and I wrapped my arms around him. He cried without sound, his body shaking against mine, his hands gripping the back of my shirt. I held him through all of it, my cheek against his hair, my throat burning. I let him break open, because he had been holding himself together for so long that breaking was the only way back. He fell asleep against my shoulder. No pretense, no experiment. Just a man who had finally let himself trust someone enough to close his eyes. I eased him back onto the bed. His face in sleep was younger, softer. The hard lines smoothed away, the scar less severe, his mouth loose and unguarded. I brushed the hair from his forehead, and felt the warmth behind my ribs blaze so bright it nearly undid me. Beneath it something stirred, something deeper, something old, something that had been sleeping inside me my entire life, and was now, slowly and unmistakably, waking up. I closed my eyes and reached for it, and it reached back. Chapter 10. The Bond Blooms. The bond did not snap into place. That is what the old stories say, that when a wolf bond completes, it strikes like lightning. Instant, overwhelming. A blinding moment of recognition that leaves no room for doubt. What I felt was nothing like that. It bloomed. Slowly. Warmly. Like the first day of spring breaking through frozen ground. Not in a single crack, but in 1,000 small yieldings, ice releasing by degrees until the whole world softens, and you can smell the earth again. I was sitting on the edge of Soren's bed, watching the dawn light move across the stone floor, when I felt it unfurl between us. A connection that went below language, below thought. I felt his heartbeat, steady and slow with deep sleep, synchronize with mine. I felt his breathing pattern itself against my own. I felt, for the first time in my entire life, completely and utterly whole. Like I had been carrying a hollow space inside me that I had been so accustomed to that I had stopped noticing it, and now it was simply full. His eyes opened, He looked at me, and I watched him feel it. The bond. Me. Everything. "Maren?" he said. My name had never sounded like that before. It sounded like home. I kissed him. I leaned down and pressed my mouth to his, and he responded with a gentleness that made my eyes burn. No urgency, no desperation. Just a man who had been very careful with very fragile things for a very long time, and was finally allowed to be careful with something he actually wanted to keep. His hand came up to cradle the back of my head. His fingers threaded through my hair. The kiss deepened slowly, tenderly, like we had all the time in the world, and intended to use every second of it. When we pulled apart, his eyes were wet. "I do not deserve this," he whispered. "You do. And I am going to spend every day proving it until you believe me." He pulled me down beside him, wrapped his arms around me, and held me against his chest. We slept. No nightmares, no fire, no screaming. Just warmth and breath and the steady golden hum of a bond that had been waiting our entire lives to find us. The investigation revealed the truth within a fortnight. Travitt had not been working alone. He was part of a faction within the court, 3 council members and a general from the Thornwall campaign, who had concluded that a king broken by grief was a king they could control. The wolves had been targeted deliberately. The Ashenfall ambush itself, which had been blamed on enemy intelligence, had in fact been facilitated by someone inside the king's own ranks. Someone had betrayed them in that valley. Someone had set the fire. When the king received the full report, I was sitting in his study. I watched him read it. I watched the color drain from his face, then return as something harder and colder than grief. He dealt with it. Quietly, thoroughly, with the precision of a man who had spent his life making difficult decisions and was not afraid of them. But that night, when the chambers were dark and Cale lay heavy at the foot of the bed, Soren pressed his face against my hair and shook for a long time without making a sound. And I held him through it. The way he had needed to be held for 4 months, and no one had known how to do it. The healing was not a single moment. It was 1,000 small ones. He still woke in the dark sometimes, his breathing sharp, his body rigid with echoes of smoke and screaming. But I was there every time. My hand found his. His breathing steadied. He pressed his face against my hair and whispered things he would never say in daylight, and I whispered them back. The wolves healed alongside their king. One by one, the survivors of the Ashenfall returned to their handlers, calmer, steadier, carrying their scars, but no longer ruled by them. Havoc was the first to sleep through the night without waking. The young female with burn scars on her back learned to tolerate loud sounds. Devorin, who had been handling royal wolves for 20 years, told me one morning over a shared cup of tea that he had never seen a recovery like it. "It is not me," I told him. "It is them. Animals know how to heal. They just need someone to stop hurting them first." Devorin nodded thoughtfully. Then he said, "And kings?" I smiled into my tea. "Same principle," I said. Cale was the last. He had spent months pressed against my side, sleeping on my feet, following me from room to room with the single-minded devotion of a wolf who had decided that where I was where safe was. The morning he crossed the room and laid his great head on Soren's knee, without hesitation, without coaxing, simply choosing the way he had once chosen me in a ruined cabin in the Thornwild, the king's eyes filled with tears. He made no effort to hide them. He placed his hand on Cale's head with a gentleness that ached to look at, and bent forward until his forehead rested on the wolf's great gray skull. "Thank you," he said, very quietly. "To the wolf, or to me, or to both." Ashenmere adjusted. Not easily, not without friction, not without a faction of the court declaring the whole situation unprecedented, and therefore unconscionable. A village apothecary, with no name and no bloodline, bonded to the Alpha King. The court found it unthinkable. The council found it inconvenient. Thessaly found it entirely, unsurprisingly predictable. I knew the moment he started leaving gifts, she told me dryly. The man can conquer a province. He cannot simply tell a woman he is fond of her. I laughed. I did that more now. The investigation into my grandmother's bloodline revealed what Thessaly had suspected. A shifter line, ancient and diluted, from a pack that had been scattered 3 generations back. Not enough to make me a shifter. More than enough to carry the recognition. The gift. The wolves had always known what I was. Even before I did. The bond mark appeared on my collarbone 3 days after the night in Soren's chambers. A soft, branching mark like frost on glass that warmed when he was close and pulsed faintly like a second heartbeat. Thessaly documented it carefully and professionally, and then, when she thought no one was looking, touched it with one fingertip and said very softly, "Extraordinary." I agreed. Months later, on a morning so quiet it felt sacred, pale winter light through the stone window, the sound of steady breathing. Kyle at the foot of the bed, his great gray head on his paws, eyes closed. Soren asleep beside me, one arm across my waist, his face peaceful and unguarded in a way that still, every single morning, made something in my chest bloom warm and bright. No nightmares, no locked doors, no fire behind closed eyes. Just this. I placed my hand over the bond mark on my collarbone and felt it pulse gently, steady as a heartbeat, warm as pine resin in firelight. I thought about the night I had knelt in a ruined cabin, hands deep in a dying wolf's chest, and refused to stop. I thought about a door exploding inward and amber eyes finding mine. I thought about a wolf choosing, and a king breaking open, and a bond that had bloomed from blood and pine, and the stubborn, unshakable conviction that nothing that could be saved should be left to die. I settled back against my mate, closed my eyes, and let the morning hold us. The end, the bond that bloomed in blood and pine. A werewolf romance YouTube script. 10 chapters, approximately 15,000 words. Outrow CTA, read to audience. If this story moved you, if you felt Maren's stubborn refusal to let anything die, if you felt Soren breaking open in the dark, then you already know what this channel is about. Stories that make you feel alive. Drop a comment telling me your favorite moment. Was it the wolf choosing? The hand in the dark? The boots that appeared? And if you are new here, welcome. You are exactly where you are supposed to be.